CD3. Unusually, the governor was also at the next Sunday dinner at the barracks. As the officers took their places, he was already standing, leaning forward with his fingertips on the mahogany, barely containing his impatience. "Gentlemen," he started, before everyone was quite seated. "Gentlemen!" Major Wyatt struck his fork against his wineglass and glared down the table at where Gosden was coughing. "I have to announce a highly important discovery made on our recent expedition," the governor announced. "It is of a most excellently promising place for agriculture. The soil is of a surpassing fertility and well watered by a noble river. I have named the place Rose Hill." Rose Hill, Rook thought. That untamed place where no rose had ever grown, where the soil was fertile only by comparison with the grey sand of Sydney Cove. "I have the intention of establishing a second settlement there, guarded by a small garrison. Captain Lennox has done me the honour of accepting the task." Everyone looked along the table to Lennox, who got to his feet, bowed his long bony body and sat again. Rook observed that he did not allow his spine to touch the back of the chair. Even sitting, Lennox was at attention. "Captain Lennox is to take a party of men and prisoners there as soon as practicable. Agriculture will be initiated at the earliest opportunity. I have every confidence that the place will rapidly feed our infant colony." Lennox blinked once, his face inscrutable. Around the table only Silk moved. One hand went to his hair and smoothed it back from his brow. His eyes found Rook's, and his face moved in a flicker that no one could accuse of being a wink. Confidence was one word for the governor's enthusiasm, Rook thought. Another might be delusion. But the governor was paid to be optimistic. His £1,500 a year would cease if the settlement were abandoned. £1,500 bought a great deal of confidence. The governor held up his empty plate. "After that time, gentlemen, I can promise there will be no more of these." Wyatt demonstrated that the governor had made a joke by forcing a loud laugh. A few others joined in. Wyatt missed nothing, so Rook quirked up the corners of his mouth in what he thought was probably a smirk. But even the worst smile was better than none. The governor looked pleased at the reception of his pleasantry. He had grown paler and more brittle with every week that passed. Everyone knew that he was on meagre rations too, had even donated his private stock of flour into the common store. "In the short term, in order to supplement the diabolical morsel," he bowed towards Silk, "I have decided to appoint 2 more prisoners to join Brugden as gamekeepers. Brugden is confident that they will be able to supply fresh meat on a regular basis and in considerable quantity." Rook thought of Brugden, out there in the woods, that powerful chest, the gun as easy on his shoulder as if part of his body. He would be an efficient killer. Rook imagined the woods like a body of water in which the ripples of Brugden's destruction would go out and out, wider and wider. With 3 men on the job, the place would soon be stripped of game. "On the matter of the natives," the governor went on, "it is a source of regret that they have proved so reluctant to come among us. I have every confidence that, if they were to do so, they would discover that we have nothing but goodwill towards them. The obstacle has, of course, been the lack of opportunity to demonstrate such goodwill. I am, however, confident—" Rook saw him hesitate, as if hearing his repetition of the word— "that this situation may shortly be rectified." Rook felt for the man, watching him cling so fiercely to optimism. With every tree cut down, every yard of ground dug and planted, his need became more urgent, to convey to the natives that new masters of the soil had come upon their demesne. In the absence of any understanding about the new arrangements, Rook could see that there was a dangerous ambiguity to the presence of 1,000 of His Majesty's subjects in this place. No such understanding was possible without language to convey it, and persons to whom the news could be delivered, and yet it seemed that the silence might continue indefinitely. The governor would not have welcomed warfare, but Rook thought he would have understood it. War was a species of conversation. But this silence was neither war nor peace. It was a null that paralysed the small, frail figure, straining to stand straight in front of his officers. The pleasure of precision was one unsung by poets as far as he knew, but for Rook the small thrill of marking the afternoon readings of the instruments into the prepared spot in his ledger never failed. September the 14th, 1788, 4 p.m. Wind northeast, 8 knots. If he were ever to attempt a poem, he thought he would take exactitude as his subject. But how would he make rhymes out of the words he would have to use? Perhaps that was why there were no odes to the thermometer or the rain gauge. Thinking about Silk, who could probably suggest such rhymes, there was an instant's confusion in his mind as he saw that the man coming down the rocks towards him was not Silk, but Gardner. Rook got up to welcome him. Gardner would have even less idea than he did himself of how one might find a rhyme for thermometer, but the idea would entertain him. Usually hearty, Gardner greeted Rook in a preoccupied way, sat at the table and downed in one swig his brandy and water. Gardner could be an odd sort of fellow. As another odd sort of fellow, Rook knew how to be patient. When Gardner spoke, his voice cracked so he had to cough and start again. "It was not well done, Rook," he said. "It was a shocking bad thing to do." "What is it, old fellow? Tell me," Rook asked, to give Gardner a little momentum. "I hear nothing out here. In my eyrie, you will have to tell me." Gardner took a breath like a sigh. "You know the governor is wanting to speak to the natives, and they will not come near. He came up with a way to settle the thing, decided in his wisdom to seize one or two by force, teach them English, learn their tongue, treat them well so they would tell the others. It was me he picked to do the dirty work." He was silent for so long that Rook thought he might say no more. "He was most particular," Gardner said at last. "We were to take the cutter down to the cove inside North Head. Someone had seen a party of natives there. We were to take some fish with us, lure a couple of the men away. You know how they love fish." He wiped a hand over his face. "We got ourselves backed into the shallow water there, held up the fish. Well, they were smart enough to be careful at the start, but we called and coaxed and dangled the damned fish. We grabbed 2 poor devils. They were slippery as eels and fought like blazes, but I had 8 good men there. We got the ropes around them in the end." Rook could see it, the boat lurching, the native men sprawled in the water slopping about in the bottom, pinned there with the sheer poundage of cursing sailors. He wanted to hear the next part of the tale, in which the natives threw off the sailors, leaped out of the boat, swam ashore, vanished into the woods. "I cannot believe that the governor—" he started, but Gardner was not listening. "They cried out, Rook," Gardner exclaimed. "By God, you should have heard them crying out. It would break your heart. The ones left behind as we got away, they were screaming. The wretches in the boat crying out. God, they may be savages, we call them savages, but their feelings are no different from ours." He jumped up as if the chair had grown spikes and went over to the window. Rook could see only his big shoulders, the back of his head. The hut was silent. Even the water at the foot of the rock was holding its breath. Rook half rose out of his chair, not knowing what to do next, only that he could not let Gardner stand there alone. But as he moved, Gardner took a long, shaky breath that ended in a cough, dragged out his handkerchief and blew his nose. He came back to the table and poured himself a drink, his hands shaking. "Well, they are in the hut behind the governor's house now. He had the shackles put on them. I'm glad I did not have to watch that." "You did your duty, that was all." How feeble that sounded. What did duty have to do with a man undone by feeling? "You did it the kindliest way, that such a task could be done, since it had to be done." "Kindly," Gardner repeated. He will put it in that light, you may be sure of it. In London they will all agree. How kindly! What a splendid fellow! Best give him another £50 a year. Rook knew Gardner as well as he knew any man, but had never dreamed that he might speak with this depth of bitterness, or how some answering sharpness in himself was responding. He had not known how much he had come to dislike the governor, that secretive, sour man. Brought in. That is what he calls it. The natives were brought in. Never mind that they were kidnapped, violently, against their will. They were crying, Rook. I tried to show them we meant no harm, but they were wailing as if their hearts would break. Who will say how it really was? Tell the truth about it. Certainly not a pair of lieutenants who know which side their bread is buttered. It was an effort to lighten the mood, but Rook might as well not have spoken. It was by far the most unpleasant service I ever was ordered to execute. Gardner's voice was low, ashamed. Rook thought, and I? Have I ever been given an order that would shake me, shame me? Nothing came to his mind. On resolution, he could not see the men his blind shots might have reached, if there had been any. In New South Wales, he had sidestepped the whole business of being a soldier through the good offices of astronomy. But it was chance, nothing more. There was a coldness in him, knowing that only accident lay between his situation and Gardner's. A loose shingle rattled, the branch of a bush scratched against the wall, a bird warbled once, twice. I wish to God I had not done it. He should not have given the order, but I wish to God I had not obeyed. Gardner was shouting, the words filling the hut and sailing out the window. For God's sake, man, have a care what you say. They were private out here, but no degree of privacy was safe when such words were released into the air. The lieutenant, who had twirled at the end of the rope that day in English Harbour, had not got so far as disobeying. Nor had the other two, the ones Rook had watched being sent into oblivion. The words had been enough. Here, where all that stood between the governor and chaos was a handful of officers, no hint of insubordination could be tolerated. Our duty, he began, our duty as soldiers. But his friend had already drawn back. Gardner drank off his cupful and screwed a grin into his face that stretched his sunburnt sailor's lips. Yes, Mr. Rook, I know. Yes, we're all servants of the governor here, and the devil take any man who says different. Rook said nothing more. There was a question forming in the back of his mind which he did not want to hear. It was, what would I have done in the same place? Early next morning, Rook went down to the settlement. He felt disloyal to Gardner, but he was consumed with curiosity about the captured natives. He wondered by what stratagem he might get a glimpse of them, but none was necessary. As he passed the parade ground, he saw the governor walking down the hill with two men shuffling in fetters. Captain Silk was looking sprightly at the governor's elbow, a notebook and pencil in his hand. The bigger of the natives was a finely made man, perhaps 30 years old. There was a roguish sparkle to his eye. It made Rook think that if Silk were to have been kidnapped and become the guest of some unimaginable chief of the natives, he would look around in just that way, with eyes that found everything interesting, and the smile of someone having the greatest adventure of his life. The other was a person of different make, shorter and sterner, a compact mass of outraged dignity. Being here was not an adventure for him, Rook thought. It was an affront to his sense of himself. The governor's narrow face had changed overnight, broadening and beaming. Today he was not nearly so much like the mathematical bridge. He held up his hand to the cheerful captive and turned it. Now, Bowenbar, this is what we call hand. What is the word in your tongue? Bowenbar. Rook saw it as if written, committed it to memory, his first word of the native tongue. Silk licked the end of his pencil and made ready to write the native word for hand. The quickest jack-in-the-box in the regiment. How had Silk got himself there with the notebook in his hand, Rook wondered. If one wanted a linguist in New South Wales, would one not ask for Lieutenant Rook? Perhaps the governor enjoyed the company of an officer of his own size, he thought, and was shocked at himself. There will be time, he told himself. Silk is no linguist, and then they will remember me. Now the governor was trying to gain the attention of the other man, holding up his thumb and waggling it. "Warrenjin? Warrenjin! Here is my thumb. We say thumb. Now tell me what you say." Warrenjin. 2 words of the native tongue. But Warrenjin would not meet the governor's eye, and had no interest in his thumb. Even though hobbled by the fetters, he walked upright and stared into the middle distance as though the governor were not there. These men were like, but not like those Rook had seen in Antigua. They were not as tall as the slaves, and their skin was not that black that was almost blue. Theirs was a warmer, browner black, nor did they have those swollen lips, fascinating in their fullness, that the Africans had. As well as those differences they were born with, there were others that he thought life might teach. These 2 men of New South Wales carried themselves proudly erect, yielding to no one. Isolation had saved them from becoming like those uprooted Africans he had seen in English Harbour, expressionless black cogs in the machine of empire. Bowenbar looked straight at Rook, at the red wool coat, the brass buttons, the gold braid, at the straight hair, the smooth cheeks, the pale skin. Under his gaze, Rook saw how strange it might be to have such hair, such skin, to cover the body with fabric and small shiny objects. His eyes met Bowenbar's, and he felt a bubble of laughter in his throat. He saw his own excitement reflected on the other man's face, the same eagerness to enter the unknown, to be amazed by difference. But now the governor was turning back towards his house, putting a hand under Bowenbar's elbow. "Come, my friend, we will eat now." He made large champing motions and hand-to-mouth actions, and Bowenbar went with him willingly enough. Silk had to urge Warrenjin to follow, going so far as to touch his arm, but Warrenjin withdrew it. Shuffling in the fetters, his face rock-like, he walked up the road, a muscular nugget of disapproval. Several times in the 2 weeks following, Rook found reasons to go down to the settlement, hoping to see more of the native men, but they were never about. Young Timpson told him they spent most of their time at the governor's house, being shown how to sit on a chair and eat off a plate. But poor homesick Timpson was not much interested in anything that was not about his Betsy, and he had no other information. Rook had wanted solitude, had schemed to be cut off from the settlement. He had congratulated himself on achieving it, but like Midas, he had his riches and was the poorer for them. His isolation was robbing him of the chance to stand beside Silk and exchange words with the native men. He put his mind to some pretext for calling at the governor's house. The ledger was all he could think of. He might request a meeting with the governor and pretend to ask his advice about any improvements that His Excellency might suggest before he filled in too many of its pages. Should he, for example, be recording the height of the tides as well as the wind and weather? It was a shallow ruse, but who knew how long it would be before he could see more of those new planets, Bowenbar and Warrenjin? He was transcribing his most recent readings into their columns, planning to take the ledger down the next day, when he heard someone hallooing outside. Captain Silk picking his way down between the rocks. "Rook!" he called. "A visitor to your enchanted isle!" Silk jumped athletically down the last few yards, lost his balance, nearly tripped, did a quick to and fro with his feet, and had arrived. "By God, you are secret out here," he cried, suppressing his panting. "A man needs to be a goat to pay you a visit." Sure of his welcome, he did not wait for an answer, but went inside. "Well, my friend, will you not offer me something cheerful to wet my whistle?" Installed at the table with a cup of brandy and water in front of him, he leaned back so that his chair creaked alarmingly. "So, what news?" Rook asked. "Ah, we are sad down at Government House, the governor and I. It is a blow, I will say, perhaps you heard. The natives have gone, last night, slipped their fetters and made off. Gone? Sadly, yes. Warringen had never reconciled himself to our company. Bowenbar seemed happy enough. You remember, the taller, cheerful chap? The governor is vastly disappointed. We were making excellent progress with the language. Oh. Silk made a show of hesitating. Rook recognised the signs that he was preparing a bon mot. Our friend Bowenbar was quite the devil of a fellow. He was at pains to teach me the words for such important notions as pissing and shitting, and the other thing as well. Propagating the species is how I decided to gloss it for the governor. Rook laughed, thinking of the governor primly accepting this form of words. Other than those exceedingly useful notions, we have an extensive vocabulary. We know, for instance, that the north wind is bu-ru-wei. He separated the syllables out carefully. Wait, or was the north wind bo-wan? Silk pulled his notebook from his pocket and thumbed through the pages. I think we are not altogether sure, to tell the truth. But the east wind is gonema. The sun is ko-ing. A mouse is bo-gull. Good is Badgeri, and we think that the suffix gal means tribe, or perhaps place. Tribe, I see. Or perhaps place. If Silk heard any irony in this, he ignored it. Bowenbar seems to distinguish something by the use of the suffix. He refers to himself as Cadigull, and then he points across the water and says something like Camere-gull. I see. Well, Rook, the governor and I were making considerable progress, but we would not pretend to be fluent as yet. His Excellency is confident, however, that there will be other opportunities. We treated them like kings, Rook, did not, of course, let them guess at our shortness of supplies, and between them in a day they made short work of what would last us a week. Warringen would not touch anything but fish, but Bowenbar tried everything, and developed something of a taste for wine. We even taught him to toast the king. Excessively amusing to see. We have every confidence that he will return before too long. Silk sat up at the table, memorising the list of words, covering the English with a hand, staring up into the underside of Rook's shingles. Ko-ing, the sun. Bo-gull, a mouse, he whispered to himself, a conscientious boy learning his lessons. Badgeri, good. Badgeri, good. He closed the notebook and stretched a leg out, ostentatiously at ease. Rook knew something was coming. My intimacy with the native men, I have to tell you, Rook, is of the most inestimable value for my little narrative. The whole story is excessively diverting, but I lack the beginning, how they were taken. Gardner would not speak to me about it. It is far and away the most momentous event that has taken place in our time here. I need detail. I need the account of an eyewitness, but he would tell me nothing. He leaned forward across the table. What did you hear, Rook? Gardner must have spoken to you of it. Rook drew back, as if from heat, took advantage of the table wobbling to hide under it, adjusting the chock that kept it steady. When he came up again, he had the words. Why, only that it was a complete success. He felt a flush coming to his cheeks. He had never learned the knack of lying. He got up and busied himself with some kindling. But Gardner said nothing to you? Silk demanded. At the time or afterwards? Or at any time since the event took place? He would have made a good lawyer, Rook thought. We speak of all manner of things, he said, snapping a handful of twigs over his knee. We have in common an interest in the heavenly bodies, of course. He heard himself, Lieutenant Rook at his least lively. Silk went on watching him. He felt the muscles around his mouth tense, straining to allow his face no expression whatsoever. Well, Silk said. He sat smoothing his hair at the back, where it curled in a glossy wave over his collar. Rook could feel the pressure of his gaze, that wordless coaxing. He felt ugly in his skin, clumsy in his attempt to be secret. He wondered if writers of narratives could smell when there was more to a story than met the eye. All Silk hungered for was a piquant addition to his narrative, But if he should get hold of the story the way Gardner had told it, in the privacy of the hut, and make it public, it would be a catastrophe. The governor would be obliged to act. The colony did not have sufficient officers to hold a court-martial, but he would have Gardner suspended from duties to live in a kind of blank until a ship arrived that could take him back to England to face judgment. And then? Gardner had not disobeyed, only regretted having obeyed. He would not be hanged, probably, but His Majesty's service could not accommodate an officer who questioned an order. The best Gardner could hope for would be to lose rank. That would be like losing a limb. Or he might be expelled in disgrace like those rebels in English Harbour. Whatever the outcome, Gardner would spend the rest of his life a marked man. "Really, Silk, you pay me a greater compliment than I deserve," Rook said. "In thinking I might be aware of things that you are not." Outside, he could hear the white parrots gathering to roost in the tree on the side of the ridge. They swooped and cavorted with harsh squawks, like creatures in pain. "I wish to God I had not done it." He had heard those words, and heard them with sympathy. That made him subject to their dangerous power. He must forget that he had ever heard them. The settlement was 9 months old, and the earliest date for the return of Dr. Vickery's comet had arrived. Rook had Dr. Vickery's calculations. The comet would reappear between October 1788 and March 1789. Every night he groped his way up to the dome. He wished he had made the room a little bigger. With a quadrant on its rock and the telescope on its stand, there was not a great deal of room for an astronomer. He had never yet seen a comet. He was 4 years too young to have seen Halley's, and since then lack of instruments or cloud cover had prevented him observing those that had been discovered. Dr. Vickery had showed him drawings of Halley's comet, but he could not believe that a glowing tail could light up half the sky, thought that the artists must have exaggerated. Nothing was lighting up half the sky over Sydney Cove, New South Wales. Inch by inch, Rook scanned the arc in which Dr. Vickery's calculations placed the comet. He took care. He did not hurry. He checked that the arc was correct. The first time he found a blur on the black sky, the heat of his excitement fogged the eyepiece, and he had to wipe the lens clear and take a few steadying breaths. He spent the next day in a state of suspension, between hope and the determination not to hope, and when he found the object again the next night, he was glad he had not hoped too hard. The blur had not moved in relation to the stars around it. It was not a comet, just a nebula sent to tease him. His days and nights became reversed. When dawn bleached the sky, he went down the crooked steps to his living quarters and lay under the blanket on his stretcher, waiting for the day to pass in sleep and another night of observation to begin. As October passed into November, a long run of cloudy nights made observation impossible, but Rook still spent most of the night awake, sitting in the dark, watching for a break in the clouds. November passed into December, and the sky cleared, but no comet appeared. By Christmas, he was frankly anxious. It had not occurred to him that he would not find the comet. He thought now that was an arrogance for which he was being punished. It was because of the comet that he was exempt from ordinary duties. That was the arrangement Dr. Vickery had come to with Wyatt. It was the basis on which the governor had allowed him to stay on the point with his musket gathering dust in the corner. If the comet were never found, where would that leave the astronomer but with his fellow officers, doing his duty with them? Rook visited the settlement only for the Sunday noon meal at the barracks. Sitting half asleep while talk washed around him, the supply ships had still not appeared. A man had been found dead of starvation. An examination by Dr. Waymark had found his stomach to be quite empty. The vegetable gardens were robbed every night. Brugden was going further afield to find game, but coming back with less. The natives had become bolder. 2 prisoners out picking sweet tea had been stoned. Another had vanished, leaving only a hacked hat. A private had become lost in the woods and staggered into the settlement with a spear clean through his shoulder. The governor ordered that no one but Brugden and his fellow gamekeepers was to go into the woods under any pretext. Some thought these attacks were a response to the kidnapping of the 2 men. Gosden and Timpson opined that the governor should not have ordered it done. Lennox and Wilstead, on the contrary, considered that he should make a greater demonstration of force. Opinion was divided, but the result was clear. The guards had been reinforced, and the Marines were standing double shifts. Rooke feared the governor would recall him from the point. "If there is to be no comet, Lieutenant," he could imagine him saying, "then I must insist you take your turn." Rooke might have asked advice of Silk, but he did not trust a man whose narrative was so important to him. Instead, he turned to Gardner. Neither of them had ever referred to the day Gardner had uttered the words that could ruin him, but between them now was a bond of trust. "God, yes!" Gardner exclaimed. "No doubt about it, Rooke. We have got to get you that comet, otherwise the governor will have you close up shop here." He brought up the old copy of Barker's Treatise on Comets from Sirius, and the two of them sat companionably at the little table in the hut, recalculating the comet's probable track. Had Dr. Vickery made a mistake? Neither Rooke nor Gardner put the thought into words, but each knew the other shared a certain private glee in checking the Astronomer Royal's geometry. Still the comet did not appear, not on the track predicted by Vickery, nor the slight variant worked out by Gardner and Rooke. From the time the stars appeared at dusk until they faded at dawn, Rooke peered through the telescope. During the day, he tossed restlessly on his stretcher, sleeping only fitfully although exhausted, and woke at dusk unrefreshed. As January came and went, the face looking back from his shaving-glass was haggard with searching. Gardner made the climb up from the settlement one afternoon, as Rooke was readying the telescope for the night. "Leave it, man. Look at you. I have never seen you so careworn. Leave it now and come out in the boat with me. Perfect tide for the whiting, and I have got the boat just down here a ways." He took Rooke's arm, amiable but adamant, and Rooke yielded. The sun was dipping low, and a flood tide was swelling the port as Rooke took his place in the stern of the little skiff, and Gardner stroked easily along. In the lee of the closest island, he heaved the anchor out. The two men sat in silence, their lines disappearing into the water over the stern. Dusk was passing into night, the shape of the land a silhouette, the sky pure light with no colour, the water mysterious, shifting around the boat. Gardner was right, Rooke thought. He had been looking into a dark tube for too long. Gardner suddenly yanked on his line, and a fish arched through the air and into the boat. "3 more like that, and we will be shot of that damned salt junk, or the unnamables that Brugden gets. Have a taste of this one, boys." He baited his hook with a slimy yellow mussel and threw the line out again. "You might write to Dr. Vickery," he went on, as if it were part of the same thought. "Give him some flummery. You will know what to say. As for the governor, well, something will turn up. But stay out of his way, I would, until it does." Gardner caught 4 whiting, Rooke 2. By the time he was making his way back to the observatory, Rooke was in a quieter frame of mind. He broiled his fish and ate them with his fingers, too hungry and tired to bother with the niceties, before sitting down at the little table, the candle close to the paper. "Reverend Sir," Rooke wrote, "I have looked out every night for the comet at every favourable opportunity, but have not yet seen anything of it. The weather, indeed, has been so constantly cloudy for these weeks past, particularly at night, that I have doubted whether it were not possible for it to have passed entirely without being seen. On the other hand, when we have clear weather, it generally lasts as long, with some intervals of cloudy, without being excessively so, or for a long time together." He was conscious of something wordy and obscuring about this sentence, but he folded the letter up. Heaven only knew when the ships would arrive that would take it to England. Before then, he hoped he would have better news. He would tear it up. No one need to be told of failure if it were followed by success. But as Gardner had guessed, the act of writing had the effect of shifting his anxiety out of his mind and onto the paper. The interlude in the soft light of the harbour had steadied him. For once he did not go up to the dome, but laid himself along his stretcher and drifted into sleep. By April, it was clear that, however an astronomer might do the calculations, no comet was going to appear. Rook had been perched out on his point for nearly a year. He devised a new justification for remaining there with his instruments, and tried not to wonder how long it would serve him. In the Northern Hemisphere, it seemed natural, an aid to navigation provided by the Almighty, but the spot around which the imaginary northern axis of the Earth rotated was marked by a brilliant star. In the south, there was no such aid. To the naked eye, the south celestial pole was an area of darkness. As far as Rook was concerned, the lack of a star in the south was one more reminder that, if there were an Almighty, he was not concerned with human convenience. But there were, in fact, stars at the south celestial pole, visible through a telescope, and the Frenchman Lacaille had mapped them 40 years before, when, as a student at the Academy, Rook learned that Lacaille had died the very day he himself was born. He felt a bond to the man, as if something had been handed on. Now he set himself the project of continuing where the other man had left off. Through the eyepiece, he made out the constellation of Loctin's Réflexions, just as if it was drawn on Lacaille's chart, and Sigma Octantis, very faintly marking the spot where the world turned. But he could see stars in addition to those marked on Lacaille's chart. Pricks of light that only an astronomer could see would butter no parsnips with the governor. His Excellency was not a scientist, did not value knowledge for its own sake. Still, Rook worked away patiently with quadrant and micrometer, marking the location of each new discovery. His measure of the months was no longer the small events and anniversaries of the settlement. Time for him was now the time of the heavens, watching each night as one constellation slipped out of sight behind the edge of the slit in his roof, and another appeared on the other side. It was an eerie feeling, looking at stars that Dr. Vickery had never seen, that even Dr. Halley had never seen, that Hipparchus and Ptolemy could not have guessed at. Until a thing was seen, could it be said to exist? And if his eye, through the telescope, were the one that brought a certain star into existence, did not that make him a creator? In the back of his mind, in a place modesty would not allow him fully to visit, was even the possibility that he, Daniel Rook, could connect the new stars he had found, and as Lacaille had done, give the new constellations names of his own devising. Rook could see so much more than Lacaille, with his now obsolete instrument, ever had. It made him wonder whether in the future some telescope of unimaginable power would reveal even more stars, and still more after that, in the dark spaces between the ones he could see. There were nights when he almost drew back from the richness of the sky. Was there, in fact, no end to it, an end only to what could be seen? Part 3. The names of things. When the drummer from the regiment came running down the rocks one afternoon, midway through the second year of the settlement, Rook watched him approaching with a blank heart. The lad would have a note in his breeches pocket. "Lieutenant Rook, I do myself the honour of requesting your attendance at Government House tomorrow at 9 o'clock. His reprieve was over, his time as creator of stars at an end. But the boy was gabbling something, a message he had memorised and now recited woodenly, his face flushed like a girl's from his run up the hill. "From Captain Silk, sir, who sends his compliments and says you will be interested to know that natives are come in. Will you join him by the stream?" As Rook followed the boy past the hospital and along beside the parade ground, he saw a group of 3 or 4 native men coming towards him. Close behind the men was Silk. The contrast between the natives, clad only in their skins, and the captain in his breeches and jacket was like a sum that did not add up. Silk did not look quite real, the braid and buttons on his red coat a filigree that bore no relationship to the chest beneath. No wonder the natives had needed proof that what lay under the covering was not a beetle or a bird, but a human being. As he approached, he could hear Silk trying out one of his words on the eldest of the natives, a lean man with a fuzz of grey hair on his chest. Budgery! Budgery! Come on, old fellow! Let me know you have ears!" The man did not respond. "By God, Rook, they're as loath to part with any speech as a miser with his gold," Silk said. "Good afternoon, by the by. I thought you would not want to miss this excitement. They began to come in last evening. Bowenbar was the first, then others came, a few at a time. Warrington is here somewhere too. The governor agrees with me that it is clear they mean to stay among us." Rook had never seen Silk so exhilarated. "Come, Rook. I do not intend to miss a second of this." He took Rook's arm, following the natives as they moved away. They registered no astonishment at the houses, the rain barrels, the gang of shackled convicts. Rook was reminded of seeing the Duke of Richmond and his party being shown the sights of Portsmouth. They had strolled along in just this way, looking to left and right with a mild, benign indifference. The grey-haired man went over to a hut. He did not knock on the door or hesitate on the threshold. He simply bowed his head to get under the low lintel and walked in, followed by the others. Silk went over to get an angle of view inside, and Rook joined him. In the hut a woman stood by the fireplace, a baby clutched tight and 2 infants hiding their faces in her apron. She was as afraid as they were, but had nowhere to hide. The men moved around the room, picking things up, a teacup, a fork, a clay pipe, and putting them down, making quiet remarks to each other. One took a piece of bread on the table and sniffed it. He dipped a finger into the mug of tea, licked it, grimaced. Another picked up a china plate, tapped it with a long hard nail, tested it with his teeth, set it down again. This was the first time they had seen a teacup or a fork, the only time they would need to taste a china plate. It would never again be the first time. Rook was aware of witnessing something unrepeatable and irreversible. He was watching one universe in the act of encountering another. When they had had enough, they turned to the doorway. Rook and Silk moved back to let them pass. Up and down the street people were coming out of huts. "The savages is coming!" Rook heard a man call out of a window. "Quick, Meg! Now and look!" Brugden, the gamekeeper, stood in the middle of the street, legs apart, the musket over his shoulder and something furry dangling from his hand, watching the natives come towards him. When they caught sight of him, they turned aside, whether because of him or by chance, Rook could not guess. They went over to the hut of a man Rook knew, barber by name and by trade. On a chair outside his door, he had a private lathered up, a towel around his shoulders. He was standing behind him, with his hand stopped in the act of drawing the razor through the white foam, staring at the naked men approaching him. The grey-haired one tilted his head and made a little gesture with his hand that said, "Kindly continue." Barber began to stroke away at his customer's face, holding the tip of his nose in a finicky way so he would not move his head. The natives followed every step of the procedure, and Rook watched the natives. There was no sense in them of alarm or apprehension. It was as if the white men were strolling players, putting on a performance for their entertainment. Barber seemed to pick up something of that mood. When he had finished shaving the private, he whipped the towel away from the man's neck with a showman's flourish. The private sprang out of the chair and played up to the audience too, patting his cheeks clownishly to show the natives how smooth the skin was, and inviting them to feel for themselves, which they declined to do. Barber indicated by gestures that one of the men should sit in the chair. He held his towel ready. The man understood him perfectly, laughing and stroking his face where the black wool grew. He seemed tempted, but another man tested the keen edge of the steel on his thumb and could be seen to advise against it. Wilstead joined the small crowd. "By God, they are savage," he said. "Dirty too. Look at the filth on them." Rook watched the men catching Wilstead's tone. The older one spoke a word or two, and they all moved on. "Well, Rook," Silk said, watching them go. "At last, eh? I had quite exhausted the literary potential of brick-making and road-building. God willing, today marks the opening of a new chapter in the affairs of Sydney Cove." "Splendid," Rook said. "At last, I can now go forward. Mr. Debrett of Piccadilly will get his sparkling narrative after all." Rook nodded, because that was what Silk expected. But he could not comprehend how a man could be presented with a moment as astonishing as a star moving out of its place, and see only the chance to make a story. He saw for the first time how different they truly were, he and Silk. Silk's impulse was to make the strange familiar, to transform it into well-shaped smooth phrases. His own was to enter that strangeness and lose himself in it. The following morning, Rook stepped outside into the pearly dawn and saw two figures silhouetted against the sky, unmistakably natives looking down towards his hut. Since his encounter with the fisherman all those months ago, he had regretted his cheerful good afternoon and the silly social smile. He had planned another way to speak the language of welcome, and now he tried it. He looked up at the men, a long gaze that said, "I have seen you." Then he sat against the wall of the hut, neither facing them nor turning his back, and waited. He was impatient for them to approach. The urge to keep glancing towards them was hard to resist. Watching the clouds in the east lit up by the sun that was about to appear, he occupied his mind with speculating on what the top of a cloud might look like. Would it be rounded, as it appeared, or was that an effect of looking at it from below? After a time it was no longer a pretence. He truly forgot the men. Then he became aware that they had come down the slope and were standing a short distance away. They still did not look at him, but nor did they stalk past. Moving his eyes but not his head, Rook saw that one was Wurunjin. Their eyes met, and the contact seemed to act as a signal. Wurunjin came forward and sat down near Rook. With him, you might almost say. Wurunjin put a hand out and said something. Said it again, looked at Rook as if waiting for him to say it. It seemed to start with a B, but there was a sort of thickening to the sound. Rook made a stab at repeating the blur of syllables, but could not get his tongue around them. Wurunjin said the word again. He was not making idle chat. He was doing a job of work, teaching a word to a man who could not hear it. Rook tried again, copying the sounds like a snatch of melody. Bural, he heard himself say, a formless bubble of language, such as an infant might make. Wurunjin said the word again, and Rook tried once more. Burawal. Wurunjin nodded curtly, as if thinking, as near as he is going to get. Then he began in dumb show to put a pocket telescope up to his eye and peer through it. He must have used one, Rook supposed. Perhaps during his captivity, along with the chairs and plates and glasses of wine the governor had offered him. One hand held the telescope, the other eased the tube in and out to focus. One eye looked steadily through the imaginary glass, the other was squeezed tight. He gestured. Telescope, distant objects coming up close, and repeated the word. Rook put an invisible telescope up to his own eye, moved the tube in and out. Burwal. Wurunjin gestured impatiently with curved fingers, bringing the distance closer. Not the object, but what the object did. Burwal was not telescope, but something like a great distance off. Burwal, Rook said again, and copied Wurunjin's gesture of scooping the distance towards him, eager to show that he was not so stupid after all. But Wurunjin was not interested in what an apt pupil Rook was, did not smile or nod in praise. He pointed across the port to where the trees of the northern shore were catching the early golden light. Kamaregal, he said, slowly enough that Rook could hear the separate parts. Then he laid a hand on his chest, over the line of scars. Kadigal, he said. Kadigal. That suffix Rook remembered from Silk's list of words. Gal, tribe, or perhaps place. Wurunjin must be saying, I am of the tribe or place called Kadi. Wurunjin leaned forward and put a hand on Rook's chest, on the front of the red jacket. Burwal Gal, he said. He left his hand there, as if understanding could flow out of it, passed through the red wool and into the heart of the man beneath. Rook could feel it, the slight pressure of his hand against him, the first touch between two separate beings. He almost expected a flash, as when lightning leapt between air and earth. And with Wurunjin's hand on his red wool chest, Rook understood. Burrawal, a great distance off. Gal, tribe. Wurrungjin was teaching him the name of his own people. Burrawal Gal, the great distance off tribe. He was pleased to have been named. It was a gift, but it was shocking too. None of the mysterious belongings or impressive skills of the white men, the ships, the muskets that could split a shield, the telescopes, the gold braid, gave them any special standing. They were just one more tribe. Burrawal Gal, the great distance off people. He hungered for more. How did you say, good morning, good afternoon, please, thank you, goodbye? How did you say, will you teach me your language? But once Wurrungjin saw that he had been understood, he got up and turned his back facing the ridge. He gave no sign, made no sound, but a group of natives filed into view and down the rocks. Another 2 men, 3 women, 3 children. They stopped in front of Rook's hut and ignored him. He felt as if he were as unremarkable to them as any other part of the place. Hut, rock, trees, man standing with his hands clasped in front of his privates like the reverend at prayer. He supposed these people did not expect much of a man who had to be taught even the name of his own tribe. They were watching Wurrungjin, who was delivering himself of a short speech. He pointed with his chin towards the hut, at Rook, down to the settlement. He paid out his flow of words like a rope with knots in it, a piece, then a pause, and another piece. Rook felt his ears bulge out of his head with listening. Not just the words were opaque, even the cadence was unlike any language he had heard. Every phrase began emphatically and faded away. Trying to hear its form was like trying to take hold of running water. Then all the men joined the one who had arrived with Wurrungjin, sitting or squatting with their spears beside them. Rook took a step in their direction. Should he join them? But one of the women, lean and wrinkled, her long dugs flaccid, her thighs fleshless, was walking towards the doorway of his hut. He made exaggerated ushering gestures. "Come in, welcome, I am pleased to see you." He was glad there was no one there to watch him. The woman did not respond to the pantomime. Her dignity made his eagerness seem false. She went into the hut and glanced around, as if it were not so very interesting. When she called back over her shoulder to the other women, a few curt syllables, they crowded inside. They inspected his domestic arrangements, murmuring to each other. One of them picked up a corner of the grey blanket over the bed and held it to her cheek, exclaiming, he thought, at the scratchy texture. They ran their long-fingered hands over the gleaming wood of the table, touched at the brass hinges where the legs folded. One lifted the cover of Montaigne and turned the pages. He wondered if they were saying, "Look, he has bark here in a little square." Would they have the idea of square? Would some wild Euclid among them have pondered the marvels of the triangle? Even in that tight space, they had a remarkable way of not meeting his eye. They moved around him, and he guessed that they were not speaking loudly because he was there, and yet he was not there. The children had been hiding themselves behind the legs of the women, peeping around at Rook and retreating if he looked at them. Now he caught the eye of a little boy, a sturdy fellow of 5 or 6, who ducked back behind his mother's leg but then looked out again. Rook smiled and even tried a wink, and by degrees the boy grew brave enough to dart out and touch one of the brass buttons on Rook's jacket, dabbing at it as if it might be hot. Discovering that the button did not bite, he lost his shyness entirely, dancing around Rook, plucking at his sleeve, pulling at his buttons, and by the look of it shouting something to the effect of, "What are these? What are they for? Where did you get them? Can I have one?" The women became bolder, holding things up to show each other, as if exclaiming over goods at a market. They spoke to him, finding it hilarious to say the few words they must have already learned from the people in the settlement. "Goodbye, goodbye. How do you do, Mr., Mrs.?" Good morning, Rook replied, making them laugh even more. "I do very well, thank you. And you?" His shaving things lay on the table, and one of the women, tall, full-figured, so magnificent in her nakedness that Rook was a little shy, picked up his razor and bent it open. He sprang across the hut to snatch it away from her, and all the amusement stopped on the instant. He tried to show them how sharp it was, cut a twig from beside the fire with the blade, and kept up a stream of words. "Sharp, you see, very sharp. It will cut anything. I use it to shave. See, here?" Out of some instinct that speech was less frightening than silence. The hut, ill-lit at the best of times, with its single window, grew dark. Rook saw that clouds had gathered low and black, and it began to rain, fat drops hitting the shingles hard enough to make them rattle. A smell of cold mud rose up from the ground. He went to the doorway and looked out. The rain hurled itself down against the rocks so violently it created a sort of spume. Under its force, the bushes lashed about, and the water of the harbour was almost invisible, the rain as thick as fog. He caught a few drops on his palm, held it out to his visitors. "What is this? How do you say wet?" The two young girls had hung back up till now, but one came forward and touched at his palm with the point of an index finger. Rook looked into her face. She was perhaps 10 or 12 years old, skinny and quick, with a long graceful neck and an expressive mobile face. He thought he saw in her the same impulses he was feeling himself, excitement tempered by wariness, the desire to explore held in check by the fear of making a wrong move. She looked straight into his eyes, and her mouth made a wry pout. Equal parts frustration and amusement. He felt his own lips form an answering shape, and saw her watching him, his eyes, his mouth, the look on his face, reading him in just the same way he was trying to read her. She was like Anne had been at 10 or 12, was his instant thought. Dark-skinned, naked, she was nothing like Anne, yet he recognized his sister in her. Old enough to want to look into another's eyes, one human to another, and still young enough to be fearless. She touched his palm again, this time with all her fingertips, stroking his skin as if to test its texture. Over the roar of the rain she said something. Like a deaf man, he watched her lips moving around the stream of words. Then she stopped and waited, her teeth resting on her lower lip in a way that said more clearly than words, "Well, what do you make of that?" He strained to separate some of the sounds, snatching at two that had surfaced clearly enough to be repeated. "Ma-ray," he tried. She smiled, her entire face involved in the act. He had thought her eyes black, but now he saw they were the deepest brown. To look so freely into the eyes of another felt as dangerous as leaping from a height. He was amazed at such recklessness in himself. "Mare," she said again, pointing with her chin towards the rain. He noticed that Warunjin and the men had gone, sheltering somewhere, he supposed, and felt a host's pang that he had not called them in when the rain began. Mare, what did it mean? Wet, something like that. So close to her, with the water cascading over the shingles above the door and pouring onto the ground, it seemed awkward to say nothing. "What a downpour!" he said, raising his voice against the din. "Have you ever seen such weather?" He listened ruefully to the drawing-room sound of that. It was the sort of small talk he could seldom manage when it was appropriate. Yet here he was, doing it as deftly as Silk might have, for an audience of 6 naked women and children with whom he shared, so far, one word. Forthright, fearless, sure of herself, she looked to him like a girl who had already mastered whatever social skills her world might demand. Pea wallen illabi. He could hear the way she was speaking slowly, making it easy for him. He tried to turn the sound into syllables, but could only get as far as the first few. She repeated each one, and he said them after her. It was like being taken by the hand and helped step by step in the dark. Paye wallen illabi. Even when he had it, it was not a perfect copy. There was something smothered or woolly, a slurring or legato quality to the word that he could not imitate. He could hear it, but his mouth did not know how to make it. Still, everyone smiled and nodded at him, and cried words that he assumed were along the lines of, "Well done! Congratulations!" So that was the word, or perhaps words. But what did it, or they, mean? Something to do with the rain, but what exactly? What a downpour! Have you ever seen such weather? The rain eased and stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The little boy pushed past Rook's legs and ran out. Two of the women followed more slowly. Rook and the girl watched them splashing up the track, now a streaming torrent that gleamed in the rays of sun already emerging from the clouds. "Yenarabi," the girl said. "Yenarabi." "Yenarabi," he repeated. Her mouth twisted, perhaps in the amusement at the way it sounded. They said it to each other a few times. For the moment it was enough to pass the echo backwards and forwards. Even without knowing their meaning, the fact of exchanging words was a kind of message. "I wish to speak with you." The girl's face was so expressive, the sense of her personality so vivid, that Rook's instinct was to take a step back and look away, but he did not. The old woman had made herself at home, puffing at the coals to bring the fire back to life, taking the twigs that the other young girl was handing her from Rook's wood basket. With a reckless sense of taking a leap, Rook laid the palm of his hand on his chest, where Wurunjin had laid his. "Rook," he said. "Daniel Rook." She caught on straight away, and made a good approximation of his name. Then she put a hand flat on her own bony chest, uttered a few syllables he could not properly catch. "Tara," he tried. Over at the fire, the other girl laughed behind her hand, and he heard her mimic his effort. He rolled his eyes, grimaced. "Yes, what an idiot I am, but harmless." He tried again, and the girl went slowly until the shapeless sound resolved itself into syllables. Ta-ga-run. The word he was making was still not quite the same as the one she had said, but he saw her face open with the pleasure of hearing her name in his foreign mouth, and at having been the one to teach him. Her name, and those other two utterances, were in his mind now, but as sounds not connected to anything, they would soon lose their shape in his memory. They were not wind or weather or barometer, but like those, these words were part of the climate of the place, data that ought to be recorded. He got down an unused notebook from the shelf, felt the girl watching as he sat at the table, dipped the pen in the ink and opened the book. On the first page, in his neatest astronomer's hand, he wrote, "Tagaran, the name of a girl. Mare, wet. Paye Wallen Ilabi." He hesitated. "Concerning heavy rain." He read the words back to her, his finger under each syllable, stumbling through. She smiled, her face transformed, every part of it involved in the great beam of delight. The old woman was calling out something. It might have been, "Come, children, time to go," because she and the two girls left soon after. At the foot of the rocks, Tagaran turned. "Yeniu! Yeniu!" she called, and he called back, "Goodbye! Goodbye!" What else could she have meant? "Come again," he called. "Come again soon. You are always welcome." But they were gone. He was farewelling the bushes tossing in the breeze. Small though it was, the hut seemed larger and emptier when they had gone. There was Montaigne on the bed where the woman had turned its pages. There was the blanket, crumpled from where the majestic one had held it up to her cheek. In the silence, the dripping of water from the roof was very loud. "Mare, wet," he said aloud. "Paye Wallen Ilabi, concerning heavy rain." He drew a neat line across the page underneath the words. It said, "This is all I know." Below, the space of white paper waited. He thought of Silk's similar notebook, his similar, though more extensive list of words. Budgery, good. Bogle, a mouse. But language was more than a list of words, more than a collection of fragments all jumbled together like a box of nuts and bolts. Language was a machine. To make it work, each part had to be understood in relation to all the other parts. That required someone who could do more than collect words and learn them by rote. It required someone who could dismantle the machine, see how it worked, and put it to use. A man of system, a man of science. Looking at the words he had written, he knew, in the way he knew a prime when he saw it, that he was that man. And everything in his life had been leading here. He saw it as clearly as a map, the map of his life and his character. He had been born with the urge to understand how things worked. He could read in 5 languages. The unknown was his daily bread. Astronomy was a profession of mysteries. Difference held no fear for him. He knew that strangeness was commonplace when you inhabited it. Above all, his temperament suited him to the task. Those qualities that made him such a diffident social being were the very ones that equipped him perfectly for listening. He knew, with as much certainty as he knew his own name, that this would be his proper work in New South Wales, to acquire the native language. Having gone so far in his mind, he went further and allowed himself to picture the day when he would brush his jacket and set off down to the governor's house with the notebooks in his hand. "Sir," he would say, perhaps it should be Your Excellency. Silk said that the governor liked to be addressed with his title. Perhaps he should ask Silk to go with him as a sort of ambassador. "Sir, Lieutenant Rooke seems to have found the basis on which the native language is founded." In fact, there would be no seems about it, but a certain modesty was becoming to a mere second lieutenant. Once the governor was paying attention, Rooke would find his voice. "I am pleased to be able to tell you, sir, that I am now able to speak with the natives such that a fruitful intercourse may be commenced." The governor would be astonished. It was hard to picture that face expressing excitement, admiration, awe, but how could he not be excited, admiring, and full of awe? Rooke would be presenting him not only with the means for the governor to fulfil his own ambitions in New South Wales, but with something bigger. The governor would be the first to learn of an addition to the world's sum of knowledge, almost as dramatic as Galileo's or Kepler's. The earth moves around the sun. Gravity is a force that operates at a distance. The journey of discovery he had just embarked on was of that order of significance. A journey not simply into the language of a race of people hitherto unknown, but into the cosmos they inhabited, the ways they organized their society, and the gods they worshipped, their thoughts and hopes, their fears and passions. After such a leap of learning, the world would no longer be the same. The first problem was not one of meaning, but of music. How to convey in the familiar 26 letters those alien sounds. Thinking out the way to start was like stretching a muscle that had been unused too long. He turned over the first page of the notebook. Those first entries had given him the beginning, but they were not the way he meant to continue. On the inviting field of the following page, he drew up 4 columns. Letter, name, sound, as in the English word. He felt a thrill, a physical thing, anticipation like an appetite. He was reminded of what he had not thought of for years, his old copy of Lilly's Grammar of the Latin Tongue, the worn maroon cover, watermarked as with dark clouds, the spine that was coming away from the binding. His father had got it cheap from a stall at Southsea, and the woodcut in the frontispiece of men picking fruit with grand studied gestures. He held the book to the light from the window and read, "Goredu tagarin. I moor it. That is, I take more of it, from cold. That is, to take off the cold. At this time Tagaran was standing by the fire naked, and I desired her to put on clothes." It was his own arrogance as a man of science to have so precisely written down every detail of that small event, so charged with delicate feeling. Stupidity, too, to have carefully formed every letter in his clear hand, so any eye in the world could read it. "A child, you say? I hesitate to contradict you, my friend, but listen to this. One of something or other, you will not have me, you don't want my company. This must be you, Rooke, and here is the answer. One of something or other else, I don't desire your company." His animated face was full of surprise, admiration, and could it be something like envy? "My word! But you are ahead of the rest of us here. Are Mrs. Butcher's beauties not enough for you? What a sly dog you are!" A sly dog? Rook did not know what Silk could be talking about. And then he did. He heard the words again in Silk's voice. Had a picture of Tagaran, some leering, grotesque Tagaran, flaunting herself at him. He felt himself flushing, a wave of heat that rose from his neck into his face, his ears, his scalp. No, no, no! Silk smiled, watching him with an inviting quirk of the eyebrow. The story was almost visibly forming about him. Our quiet friend Mr. Rook and his little friend Tagaran. Calm, Rook told himself, calm at all costs, or the story will be graven in stone. No, you misunderstand. What you read there, she was not speaking to me, but to another child. In trying to be casual, his voice had become husky. Some of them come now and then to beg food from me, and so on. This was surely dull enough, and not even a lie. I myself had no part in the exchange, other than recording it. They were having an argument. One was going off in a huff, but came back later. He was explaining too much. Silk was watching, smiling, his legs crossed, jerking one knee up and down so his foot bounced, waiting for silence to do its job. One of them has proved herself to be an excellent tutor of the language. One of them. It was to protect Tagaran, but it was a betrayal. Tagaran was not one of them. She was herself, unique in every particle. "My dear Rook," Silk said at his most urbane, "there is no need to explain. We are both men of the world." Men of the world.